has been sparked by Stephen's talk. I'm a product in the scientific community. I've been churned through the mill, if you like, from physics to geophysics, glaciology, atmospheric sciences. And my passion for science has kind of been dampened by the community that I found myself in, because it was very rational, logical, didn't invite a creative aspect. And I had a passion for where I work. I work in Antarctica, and I look at how ice and clouds talk to each other. And in that landscape, I just come alive. And that's where I really connect to the earth and feel like I'm part of the earth. And I've had this journey from that very scientific background, and now I work as a wilderness educator. So I take people into the wilderness, I train people in Antarctica, I connect them with that landscape, and I have an amazing sense of purpose doing that with people. But I still feel this draw back to my climate change stuff, how can I be effective in climate change? So what's been going on for me this week, and for a lot of other people, is these splits in me have been opening up, and it's almost like I've had permission, certainly from the scientists, Jeff and Stephen here, to actually give a voice to those parts of me. And I'm not sure that there'll be a synthesis of them, but it's just been really wonderful to be able to give a voice to them and say, yes, I do have a spiritual side, and it's very important. I do have a scientific, curious, investigative side, and that's very important. I do have a side that wants to speak through language, and that's important. I do have a side that wants to speak through the earth and the connection with the earth. And I'm hearing all of these parts of me have been given permission to just exist. And my question is, if we gave all scientists that permission to recognise those different voices, what would our science be like? What different would it be? Who would like to start?
Yeah, I think it'd be great. Maybe Mitch, you can talk to this too, because I think scientists become fascinated with things, and to be given permission to move outside of that guild and be allowed to experience science in context, I think doesn't diminish science, it actually improves science. But that's not the common way that people are trained.
Can I comment a minute?
Yeah, please.
When I wrote Bringing Biosphere Home, I was real interested in finding out who the exemplary biospheric naturalists were. That is, people who studied the entire biosphere and made it come alive and had leaps of imagination that enabled them to transcend scale. And I found people like Lynn Marvelous, who talks about bathing the primordial ooze. Or Tyler Volk, whose beautiful book, Gaia's Body, was really a wonderful book about Earth biogeochemistry, but he talks about living as a carbon atom and moving through all the different spheres of Gaia. Richard Forty, who wrote a wonderful book called Life, A Natural History of about 4 billion years of life on Earth, starts his book where he's bathing on Ordovician shores. And he's imagining what it's like to sort of exist in that place and time as an introduction to a science. And it occurred to me that there were three critical ingredients. One was the life of the imagination, that all these scientists shared that in common. They were able to transcend scale through this sense of being someplace else in space and time. But they grounded that through their empirical analysis. Those things worked hand in hand. But the third was this notion of identification and compassion. They could actually, it was not just the imagination to place themselves there, but actually to become that era, or to become the species they were looking at. And I don't know what would happen if I looked at several hundred exemplary biospheric naturalists, but I'll bet, Darwin too was like that. I'll bet that if we find these, and what I mean by a biospheric naturalist is someone who's able to journey through all those spatial and temporal dimensions. And in a way, that's what you were describing, in terms of being in Antarctica and then the wilderness exploration. So I don't know, it would be fun to do to actually look at more data than what I looked at, but my bet, what I believe to be true, even though I can't prove it, is that exemplary biospheric naturalists merge those three spheres, and that's what makes them great.
Any other comments?
Let me, it is a contrast, but a couple years ago, Jared Diamond came to visit my campus, and we had a great opportunity to talk with him. Collapse wasn't out yet, and he made a very remarkable comment to us at the end of this discussion, and that was that he's a physiologist by training and is in the Department of Physiology, I think it's UCLA. When Guns, Germs, and Steel won the Pulitzer Prize. He's in what?
She's in geography.
He moved from graduate school to
Okay.
geography, but he started.
Yeah. That's okay. But when he told his colleagues about the book after it won the Pulitzer Prize, not before. In other words, in his mind, his colleagues had no idea he had written a book. And we asked him why, because here's this fabulous writer, and what he said was, I just couldn't predict what they would say and do. And then he went on to note that he felt like he'd been heavily penalized in his department for his popularization activities, that they viewed that as, peripheral, and why would you spend your time? And that's a very historic and old-fashioned way to think. And I was shocked to hear him say it, but it was kind of interesting. And this was as late as 2 years ago, so.
My perception on this is things are changing. I think that it's more and more possible and likely that a scientist can express other sides of themselves and not suffer a degradation or credentials in the scientific community. But there's still a long way to go. I mean, if you go to an American Geophysical Union meeting where there's 20,000 scientists at those meetings, there aren't many talks you're going to sit in and hear someone, expressing more than what they're showing on their graphs and their plots and facts. Occasionally you'll see somebody that pushes that down. It also depends on the audience. I think when scientists are amongst themselves, they don't do this. They have less of a tendency to do it. But if there's more of a mix of different disciplines, there's a sense of greater freedom in being able to push that. And I also think it makes a big difference if you're talking to earth scientists or ecologists compared to, say, the physical sciences, of how far they feel they can push that boundary. And that's just a subjective observation of my own. It could be completely wrong. It'd be interesting to do some studies on where the scientists themselves feel, where they're at in this, how far they feel they can express other sides of themselves.
I was drawn to interdisciplinary science at the beginning of my career. I think there are a lot of scientists who aren't drawn to that. And so for the group of organic chemists that I went through my PhD with, I would say probably 99% are still doing some form of synthetic, organic, or pharmaceutical research. And this is not a forum that they would ever even think of coming
I have a question about the norms that both of you sort of described in what journalists need from scientists, in order for us to sort of get our messages into the media. It seems to me this is a very one-way, or only the one-way perspective on this communication. You describe an institution with very specific norms and political economy you haven't even touched on underlying this, and in some ways, all the things that you said. You want something episodic rather than thematic, brief, not extended, individual, not macro, local, not global. They're exactly opposite to the things that we really care about. And so the institution and its norms become actually stumbling blocks to conveying the magnitude and the complexity of the story that we're talking about and that we feel needs to be understood. And I really put this I don't want to put it just on the media, because I think there's a failure in education, there's political economy that makes this very difficult. But the question is, what are the opportunities for the institution of the media, in, you know, that large collective, for that to open up, for that to come toward what is needed? I mean, you have such an important role to play in this conversation and to engage people. And what is it from the side of the media that can, you know, what's the steps you can take? I mean, we can become as good as we can get in communicating to reporters, to the news, whatever, and it will always only do then a partial job if we fit perfectly into what you want from us people. So what can the media do to change itself to help?
Let me do a couple things, then turn it over to you. Let's see. One is that, remember what I was, you know, these are these daily journalists who are involved in this daily production of information. I think as long as that daily set of expectations pertains, you get this. You get this signaling as a primary goal. In other words, you know, what they know is that the typical reader of a newspaper story doesn't even read most of the story. Gets in about 2 or 3 paragraphs. The bulk of that story is simply not acknowledged by audiences. What a reader walks away from with a typical story is maybe 1 point. And actually, in television news, about which I tend to be very critical, the modal bit of information you walk away from is 0. Films are very different, so I'm not saying, but you know, from a TV, the TV news is structured in a way that actually prevents learning, as best I can tell. But again, so as long as the media are in their current configuration, they actually are operating quite efficiently for the goal, you know, for what they can do. What is changing, of course, is the perceived role of these major media outlets. With the rise of the web and 24-hour news, newspapers, I can see visibly acknowledging that they are no longer in the breaking news business. So if you're not in the breaking news business, they're beginning to ask themselves, and you're losing readers by the cartload, what do you do? And I'm seeing some newspapers, the New York Times is a good example of this, beginning to turn like an ocean liner, admittedly, but turn to this more explanatory journalism form, to acknowledging that the breaking stuff is out there, and now what they have to do is provide the foundational explanatory dimensions of a story. Again, that doesn't include the small little newspapers in towns like Aspen who still view themselves as the breaking news events. The other thing that's happening again is there are lots more places for people to go, and now I think all of you can do end runs around the media by doing your own stuff. Setting up, websites and blogs and everything else. They're going to be incredibly difficult for publics to evaluate. But I think we everyday people, as we confront this really multivariate information world out there, are going to have to learn how to evaluate these things because we now have to be very much in a decision mode when it comes to deciding what we'll read and what we won't. Nancy.
Well, I think a big part is establishing relationships with key people and influencing them by bringing them in and exposing them to the complexity, the wonderfulness, and the richness of the story to be told. And I see Michelle nodding. Do you want to add to that?
But that's still more of what the scientists ought to do. I found actually that we did not resolve that dichotomy in the Ellen Leopold program, where I felt the journalists very much still walked away with, you've got to feed us what we need.
Oh, yeah.
So it still remained a pretty one-sided effort to change. You did not train the journalists. I mean, not that you
some of the messages that journalists will tell you, though, is that, for one thing, it is not the role of the journalist to educate. The journalist is not your friend. The role of journalism is very much to be a signaler to society. But you can look at Elizabeth Colbert in The New Yorker with those 3 stories. Now, there's a woman who used to just cover New York politics, but she has just been completely compelled by what she has been exposed to do this. Now she's doing ocean stories. I mean, she has not left. I met with her for coffee not long ago, and was talking with her about how she's really trying to push this envelope because she is personally convinced it is the most important issue of our time. And I think the more that we can, I don't think it's really helpful to sort of say, well, what are you gonna, it's like in a relationship, well, what are you gonna do about it? I think it's much, I think our challenge is to think about how can we build these coalitions, because it's not coercion, and that is what it's all about, bringing these journalists in to, for them to make their own connections with individuals to see what is compelling to them. Just one more thing that I thought was really interesting was when Ken Weiss did this series on altered oceans, he had all sorts of media interviewing him. And one of the questions, NPR Day to Day asked him, we noticed that you didn't show the two sides of climate change in your story about, oceans of acid. Why is that? And he said, because the weight of evidence is such that we're past that. And that maybe there's people arguing over little pieces here or there. I really do think there's a big shift in the world of the media by people like Andy Revkin. I could just list all of these names of these people who are intelligent people who arrive at their own conclusions at a certain point, and they don't feel compelled to play this mood on the one hand or on the other.
Although Revkin wrote a big piece in the New York Times just saying, well, here's the other hand. Don't get too aligned with recent things.
It's interesting to me that you talk about journalism as if it only has one form, as print. And I would like to know what you're doing since we somewhat have agreed that not everybody reads newspapers anymore to the extent that we were hoping, but what are you doing to treat or to train or to enlighten, or whatever you want to call it, other media who are not print media, but may have as much of a impact on the news that we're getting?
Well, I know a lot of, and forgive me for actually emphasizing print. That is wrong. I don't mean to be the perception, because in fact, print is the minority in many ways. But there are, C Studios has just done this huge, powerful series, Strange Days on Planet Earth. We're now working on the ocean equivalent that you and Hal have done enormous work. And then you have you should be answering this question because...
We'll ask for that tomorrow.
Okay. But, and radio, the NPR and all these local stations are incredibly powerful and important and actually very involved in a lot of these things.
Mm-hmm. I have a curiosity question, and this isn't serious. To what extent after watching your presentation in particular, to what extent do journalists take philosophy
Well, I will say I know. Actually, a number of science writers I know. I don't know. Again, science and environmental writers sometimes peel themselves off in a kind of territorial way. It's kind of interesting. But a number of the science writers I know have come out of history and philosophy of science. In other words, have master's degrees in that area.
Because many of the issues that you were getting at towards the end of your talk, I was actually sitting here looking at them. Those are philosophical issues.
Yep.
You use the word truth. 4, 5, maybe 6 times.
Right, that's right. And I don't think journalists would frame those issues the way I do. I mean, that's just my take on it.
And the objective of observation of the person that's being interviewed
for me, it raises issues around what's the phenomenology of that process.
When I have a chance to train, and I do, we have a grad program and get quite a few individuals interested in science and environmental journalism in. And again, the journalism part rather than the documentary and this whole, there is a huge array of communicators out there doing different things. But what I try to do, there's still, I think, a default notion that if you want to be a good science writer, you get a little bit of training and then you go, what you really need is a degree in zoology or a degree in, and so many of my students, true. Well, many of my students go out and go that direction, but if I have a chance, what I tell them is if you're unsure about what you want to do outside of my skill building, I said, let me send you to the history of science department, the philosophy department, where we have philosophy of science courses, we have a wonderful sociology of science group building that looks at science again as a social system. All these great courses that have you thinking about what science is and how it behaves in culture. And I get a good number of them who head that direction.
Brooke, Tony, Norm, Andrew, in that order.
Mine was just as a follow-up to Susie's comment. You're sort of asking journalism to change, and I think the presentation that we saw here was presenting journalism as this interface between science and society. And I think one thing that I see happening is maybe not necessarily journalism changing in advance, sort of leading the front, but sort of having to accommodate for changes in society's behavior. My question was going to be about blogs and the web and how scientists now have their own pathway to society and to audiences. And I just kind of had a comment or a question about, one thing that I think is really interesting is sort of the Wikipedia effect, where now you see these people, there's sort of an assumption that was made that if you open up an encyclopedia to everyone's voice, that you'll get a distortion of reality. And what they've actually found is, if you compare the Britannica with all their experts and Wikipedia has less mistakes actually than Britannica does now. And so it's totally an unexpected result, but I think it's just an interesting observation that this interface of journalism being the voice of reason, and you have to be signalers and you have to follow these protocols to properly present information to society. Maybe some of those rules aren't necessarily true, and I just wonder how you see that observation of these things happening reflecting back on journalism as did you see that sort of self-reflection and looking at what's happening in the way information is being distributed? Or?
Well, journalists discuss this a lot amongst themselves. It's a big topic, and I think the views are very divided. And I wouldn't say there's a weight of opinion on this. There was a very interesting article recently in the New Yorker. Did you read that about Wikipedia and about how it all started?
Well, one thing I thought was also just kind of interesting real quick is, Tony, you put up a slide at the end of your presentation. There was a comic that was sort of warning of the democratization of science. And I've talked a lot about this with some of my friends about whether that would be a good thing or a bad thing. And that obviously implies it's a bad thing, but then Wikipedia sort of suggests maybe it can be a good thing and a path to truth. But I don't know, I'm still stuck in the middle. There's pros and cons about it. So.
I thought I heard that Wikipedia bill was going to start limiting the number of people that can contribute to it.
Yeah, I mean, they're facing problems,
That's
right?
Yeah,
exactly. So,
I would say I've been journalists and the journalism community is now very sensitized, and this is going to be very hard. They're having debates now about what is a journalist as a result of this sort of broadening of information providers, because it matters. There are, journalists get access to things that other occupations do not. Access to prior copies of articles in major journals like Science and Nature. They get access to scientists at major scientific meetings if they have the right credentials as journalists. And suddenly you've got people, all kinds of people doing their own blogs, for example, making claims that they are now journalists. And so it's becoming a very interesting debate about how you tell who is a journalist and who isn't. And I'm not at all sure how that's going to come out.
Sharon, I had a question to you. When you were talking about balance, you used the word perspective, getting perspectives, and that's what the use of balance does. The word that fell on my ears when you said perspective is op-ed.
Is what?
Op-ed. I immediately thought op-ed. Because to me, the op-ed section of papers is perspective, as opposed to other parts of the paper which are not perspective.
Well, and I want to be careful with flinging around words too. What I meant by that is there, most of science, frankly, is contested in one way or another. And when you're in a contested arena, what you have are often a whole variety of legitimately credentialed scientists making truth claims. And so what balance does is it requires a journalist to go out and represent some of those, more than one of those truth claims, basically. And again, one could argue that truth belongs there, and other points of view belong in op-ed. But I think what the journalist is doing is saying, I cannot be the arbiter of what that single truth is.
Right, and the criticism of balance in general, and I share it, I think, personally, is that it's all too easy for a journalist to get on the phone, contact scientist A and scientist B, and have the story finished in 5 minutes. But I would ask the question, has that person done justice to the story in doing that, although they satisfied balance?
It all depends on what. And this is a very crass thing to say, but I remember when I was a science writer for a newspaper years ago, back when newspapers actually mattered, back in those days, and I was rewarded for turning those stories in as quickly as possible. My editors had no idea if what I was representing was truthful or accurate, and those are two different concepts, of course. Okay, they had no idea. And so all the rewards I got were for generating that story by the deadline. And I'm guessing there's a certain element of that production focus, very much an element of that production focus today.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. I want to respond directly to your question and throw out an opportunity for scientists to meet directly with educators and with the general public through a different medium or medium. About 4 years ago, I got a call from somebody at the Harvard Medical School who, with an educator at the New England Aquarium, wanted to convene a group, and I was happy to do that since it's critical work, of people that they knew in New England who were A, interested in the climate issue, and B, worked either in a nature center, an interpretive center, a place where the public came to learn about science and nature. And we had several meetings. The first one, maybe 10 people came. The second one, the standing room only, with about 30 people there. And what this evolved into was something called the New England Science Center Collaborative, which was docents, interpreters, people who worked at planetaria, museums of science, aquaria, nature centers, and they all had one thing in common. In addition to having publics go through and learn about science, they had an abiding interest in climate change. And that group, I got them funding from EPA, they're now getting foundation money, turned into something called the New England Science Center Collaborative. And now it's the Northeast Science Center Collaborative, with membership of about 40 public institutions that have publics coming through them every year. And the throughput annual of public is something on the order of over 4 million people. And this collaborative meets periodically, and they share information about their exhibits and their ways of going about educating the public. But they also bring in science experts. So this would be people from the New Hampshire Institute of Earth, Oceans, and Space, people who are from the cold storage laboratories, atmospheric scientists who are IPCC level people from MIT, and they meet with not only members of this collaborative, but they bring in school teachers, high school teachers and junior high school people, and the scientists interact with these educators, and that enables the educators to interact with the scientists. It gives the scientists an idea through that interaction of the kinds of things that teachers and educators have to know about in order to convey their message about climate change. So it's a really kind of neat model, and I worked with this group. There's now a group in North Carolina. I was talking with Kimberly at lunchtime about the notion of could there be one for Colorado centers or Rocky Mountain states, or when you go back to your states, think about approaching museums, particularly ones that are interested in imparting science information, and linking them up with climate scientists or vulnerability experts, impact specialists. I think it's a pretty neat model, and as I say, it can be mutually reinforcing. It's really attractive to foundations, so it can then sustain itself. So there's another way to reach a public in a kind of a simple way that also forms a network of people, so it's self-strengthening too.
Thank you. I would like to keep this to another 5 minutes at the most, because some of us instigated for a free afternoon. But I can get there. So, a couple of other comments, questions? David?
I'll pass them.
Dennis?
I'd like to add another dimension to scientists and their experience and not reporting. I'd call it maybe a Jungian dimension. Being a Jungian and a scientist, I hear scientists tell me things that are so unusual, they'd only tell it to a Jungian because they think we're kind of weird anyway. But the example, and this is one of many, but this is example from science. One of the scientists I know has studied his whole life, spent his whole life studying a particular insect. And he keeps this insect in an environment totally cut off from the outer world. So the natural rhythms of the insect, what they call the circadian rhythms, when there's no input from the environment, how does the insect work? And the way they detect the active and inactive period is by having a microphone in this chamber, and it records when this insect sings. So he knows very well, after studying this insect for years, what the patterns are. And he said, but you know, there's something very unusual happens. He said, I can't tell this to my scientist friends, but I noticed that often when I come into the lab, and it's not when a graduate student comes in, these insects will sing outside of their circadian rhythm. So this is in a chamber, a growth chamber, totally cut off from the world, no vibrations or anything. And here, this insect somehow or another responds when he comes in, not any of the lab workers, not any of the staff or anything. So, like I say, there are these stories out there that are kind of in another dimension.
Hey Dennis, is it the case that the maintenance worker is home telling his wife, listen, Mabel, I can't tell this to anyone else.
That's great.
Stephen, I'm just sort of really trying to get a handle on some of the Jungian terminology, so I might have misunderstood what I think might be an implication of something you said. But early in your presentation, you said that technology was the shadow of science, right? And I'm not really sure exactly what you meant by that.
Yeah. Maybe I should sort of clarify. I feel like technology has really done a lot for humanity. So, in a general sense, I think that it's been very, very positive. What I meant was that it can have, there are some dark sides to technology. people's reliance on technology to solve problems, the way that technology influences human behavior. Those kind of things, I think, are more of the unrecognized and unspoken problems associated with technology. So I didn't mean that technology was bad and it's all evil. What I was trying to get across is that the benefits of technology are not always in the interests of where I think society should go. I think there can be negative consequences.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what I thought. I'll say very quickly. I mean, I worry. I do a lot of work in philosophy technology, and one of the overriding concerns of philosophers who work in this area is to try to push science and technology closer together and see them as part of a common enterprise rather than separate, which they are culturally, between cultures of scientists and cultures of engineers, and often conceptually. And it's kind of interesting because the engineering community has become surprisingly open to the whole question of individual and social responsibility of engineers, much more so than I've seen among scientists until quite recently. And partly it's because engineers have gone through things like the Challenger explosion, which launched 1,000 ships and sort of worked on whistleblowing, right, in engineering firms and things like this. One kind of interesting exception right now that might help to push these things together, if you think that this is a problem, is the nanotechnology industry, and I've said this to a couple of people as I'm involved in this, has pushed for a kind of a 1% for social responsibility, right, for the national nanotechnology incentive grants of the U.S. federal government, which amounts to millions and millions of dollars, given how big these grants are. So there is a huge opportunity right now for philosophers, theologians, sociologists, social scientists of all kinds to get on the ground floor of talking about the social implications of nanotechnology. The reason is the nanotech industry doesn't want to happen to them what seems to be happening to the GM industry, certainly in Europe, maybe here in the US. And so, like, Michigan State has $1.5 million, right, to work on the social implications of nanotechnology. Montana just got $300,000. We just got $500,000. So it's really quite amazing. And in that sense, now we're finally getting scientists to think not only about the responsibility for the kinds of work that they're doing, which may or may not later have, right, a technological implication.
I agree with you 100%. I think one of the problems as a pure scientist is that there isn't the introduction of the concept of values. And what are you really doing with the science that you're working on, or what might happen with it at some point in the future? I just don't think that we consider that.
Great.
Just quick gut reaction. Just this, when I listened to this, I wanted to be a scientist, and I crashed against a wall, and then I had to do a whole lot of other things to survive and to figure out how I was going to make meaning out of my life and really struggle with making a life. And when I listen to scientists, in a sense, I get the feeling like, well, scientists are learning what it's like to live in a world that's really crazy and complicated, and that you're going to get misunderstood, and that people aren't going to, they're going to marginalize you, and they're going to, well, hello. Yeah. So I kind of watch those films in disbelief, like, well, how did the scientists get themselves in that predicament? That they got so isolated, they got so, hear these words about, that they can maintain
graduate school.
They can maintain their individuality in such a radically pure, use the word pure way. And I think, and so on a gut level, I say, well, why don't you all get together and as a club and decide who wants to represent you to the media? I'm not a scientist, but I play one on TV, kind of thing. Who kind of can speak intensely for the level that you agree on. You guys don't work well together at all. You don't play well together, and so to work out the minute details of that seems kind of crazy. Just get together and figure out what your damn message is. And anyway, something like that.
Actually, there's a great example of this, which is a great example of this on a very practical level is there's one community that really did get their act together. That was the astronomy community. As a group, they got together and they asked themselves, what do we really want to do? And they came up with the Hubble Space Telescope. They went to agencies and they said, we speak with one voice. This is what we want to do. It's going to cost enormous amounts of money, but this is what we do. And they got it. There's no other community that's been able to do that.
Well, particle physics a bit.
No.
Although they haven't succeeded, but they succeeded in making the pitch for the super.
And the solid state physics community really envies the particle physics community and are upset that so much money goes to particle physics. So it's, could you get the whole physics community together to go and say, this is what we want? That's what the astronomers were able to do. So, you're right, it rarely happens.
But that's also what the sustainability sciences is trying to do, to
Yeah.
put money in this direction and say, the future of the planet may rest on it.
Yeah, I was particularly interested, just to go to, somebody made a comment about what journalists are being taught to say, but more importantly, what not to say. And somebody on your video said that. And that to me is a really hard concept to get across. And I wonder if that's something that you have to struggle with. And how long does your leadership training program actually last for journalists?
Susie, I don't think I mentioned this, but actually Susie did all the Leopold program, which is why Sharon and I are here.
Quite possibly. So can you tell us a little bit about how long that's been?
It's done, that particular program is done in 2 sessions, each of which is about 2 weeks long. And the first session is really, giving the basics of how to work with media, very focused on that communication aspect. The second piece actually takes place in Washington, where you get to practice what you preach, not only with media, but also go to Congress, talk to business people, talk to NGOs. So it's actually, I think you talk about 5 modules, right? Working with the media, with the politicians, business, NGOs, and the leadership component per se. What are some of the aspects that are needed for that, and sort of how to be a scientist that's willing to go out in the public and speak out, and how do you then go back to your own cohort and sort of function within that, not lose credibility. So there's a lot of discussion about those aspects of how to be out of the closet scientist.
I'd like to sort of state the obvious from a scientist's perspective, which is we didn't go into science because we necessarily like people.
Okay.